Just a little bit about myself. I am a partner with Hogan Lovells, and I spend my days helping medical device and digital health companies with the FDA clearance and approval process. And as part of that, I've had the opportunity to see a little bit of the industry and get to know some of the challenges and also the opportunities that a lot of these technologies present. And I think we have a great program today. I think there's some really interesting companies that are going to be presenting. And I think, one of the things that we're here to talk about is really what is the state of the industry? Where are we today? There's been a lot of buzz about digital health and mobile health and other names that people use for these digital medicines, digital therapeutics for maybe the last 5 or 6 years. And I think we're now sort of seeing everything come together and starting to see the real promise of a lot of these technologies. And we see things like some of the companies presenting today, medical therapy via video game, right? It's such an interesting concept, gamification and personalized and targeted insulin delivery from an artificial pancreas system, which is something that's been talked about for a very long time and is really now coming to reality. Remote patient monitoring, innovative biosensors, virtual reality pain relief. So things like these and some of the other companies we'll hear from today really have the opportunity to transform healthcare, not only in the way that it's delivered, but also in the actual therapies and solutions that are available. And at the same time, we're here in the same building as the Biotech Showcase, and I think pharma and biopharma, biotech has really looked at digital health as a very interesting and innovative way to collect data in a clinical trial setting, but also to improve their patients' experiences, adherence, and other challenges that their patient populations face. Digital health brings a lot of promise to addressing those as well. At the same time, I think digital health, there's a lot of discussion in the media about some of the challenges that digital health solutions face. Just yesterday there was a report that came out about cybersecurity concerns related to health apps, which is broader than the set of digital therapeutics or digital health solutions that we're here today to talk about, but nonetheless has been a concern for the digital industry for a while now. At the same time, regulatory pathways continue to evolve, and we're going to talk this afternoon. There's a session about regulatory pathways, and obtaining reimbursement continues to be an issue that companies have to grapple with and figure out in their business plans what is the right way to seek payment for these solutions. At the same time, despite all these challenges, which I have no doubt that the digital health industry will overcome with time, the estimates project that the market for mobile health products will account for as much as $23 billion by 2020. So there's obviously a lot of opportunity here, both from a business and from a medical standpoint. And perhaps because of that, investment in the digital health space has been at record levels for the last 2 years. I think that today we have a fantastic panel of speakers who are here to talk a little bit more about where are we at today, where are we going in 2016, what are the trends, what are the challenges. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists to each talk a little bit about what perspective they bring and their experience with digital health so far. We have a great panel of speakers for you, and I'm going to start with, to my left, Vivek Bhatt, who is the Chief Technology Officer at GE Healthcare Life Care Solutions. Vivek has been at GE with a background in product planning, marketing, engineering, and technology investment. He has a PhD in mechanical engineering from Cornell. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vivek to talk a little bit about GE's perspective and where are the opportunities and what your experience has been with digital health so far.
Right. So as Yarmila said, I've been with GE for the last 20 years. And it's been a very exciting journey as you think about digital today. Way back when we were talking about moving from film X-ray to digital X-ray, so this is 15, almost 17 years ago. And once we made that move from the analog world to the digital world, and the possibilities it opened up for GE Healthcare and for our customers to really understand how to look at images, how to look at anatomy in a very, very different way. And the amount of information it unlocked and the analytics you could run at that level was just tremendous. Now, fast forward to now, and you say the same thing is happening in every aspect. As you look at a human being, there is the anatomy, there is the biochemistry, there is the vital signs. All of those things that are happening to a patient, to a human being, are being digitized today. And the amount of data that it unlocks, what you can do by combining all these different streams that's happening inside the human being, it's just tremendous. And at GE Healthcare, we're looking at all of those areas, combined with what's happening at healthcare at a system level. So when you take what's happening at the system level and what's happening to the human being, there is a huge potential in terms of outcomes for patients and the cost that the healthcare systems have. So that's kind of what the perspective for GE is in terms of where digital is and where we want to be playing.
Great. I'll start by introducing PureTech. What we do is we start companies from scratch, translating cutting-edge academic technology. When we start a new company, we'll go and in-license any relevant intellectual property into that new company. We'll act as the initial management team to drive that company forward, and we'll fund that company. And then as that company matures, we'll go and hire in additional personnel and also have money to continue to fund the company. We have 12 companies in our portfolio. 7 of them are what we call our growth stage companies. They're more mature. 5 of them have human proof of concept based on clinical data. And we have 3 digital companies, including a company I was involved in co-founding called Achille Interactive Labs, which is aiming at producing the first FDA-approved mobile video games for improvement of cognition in a number of different disorders where cognition is negatively impacted. I think our perspective really is coming from a medical one. So the background of PureTech, the people of PureTech was really biomedical sciences. We have drug companies, we have medical device companies. And so when we went into digital, our thinking really was, let's come at it from the perspective of how can we use digital tools the same way you would almost think of using a therapy, like any other either monitoring tool and diagnostic or any other therapeutic. So what we're very interested in is clinically validated tools, including ones that could actually get FDA approval, but which are digital. And we think that's very exciting. So this idea that you could have a drug-like effect, but you're doing it through a digital therapeutic instead of an actual pharmacological therapeutic. And that's really where we see things going, is this convergence between digital and traditional medical, with the end game really being digital, ends up being part of mainstream medical use, not just something that's a consumer product, but actually gets integrated into patient care on a more daily basis. And eventually, you know, that's not going to be overnight, but that's where our interest is, and that's where we think things could end up going.
Great. Well, I'm Christine Lemke. I'm one of the co-founders and the chief product officer of Evidation Health. And Eric's introduction actually tees it up perfectly for me. So our company has products and services to help biopharma companies and payers and providers assess the clinical and economic utility of lots of digital therapies or services around the pill. And so if you think about how to determine whether some of these things are working and for whom and when, you have to run those studies very differently than you might run just a traditional clinical trial. And you have to have access to populations, you have to collect a lot of data and aggregate it, you have to do analysis on that data in a much different way and get the consumer, keep the patient engaged with you during that entire process. And so we help do that for lots of companies. And then my personal background, by the way, our company is funded by GE Ventures, thank you, and Stanford Healthcare. And my personal background is large-scale behavior analytics, so machine learning applied to consumer behavior. Worked with MIT Media Lab and Columbia University on my past startup, and then also worked at Microsoft Xbox doing largely the same, trying to predict consumer behavior based on large-scale sensor and behavior data.
Thank you. I think actually my intro might be the briefest, but my name's Kevin McRae, CEO of WellDoc. My background actually is a little different. All of it is in biotech and pharma, so I've been coming to this meeting for a lot of years. worked for Abbott and Genentech and Human Genome Sciences. Switched into digital health about 2 years ago, and I was just so intrigued by the space and where it was going, but also the company WellDoc. And what we do is we followed a life science model, from the beginning. So we've been around actually about 10 years. So we aren't the new hot digital health, but we're kind of one of the trailblazers. And we've conducted clinical trials that have been published in peer-reviewed journals, which have demonstrated significant outcomes. We've received FDA clearance for our product, a piece of software, as a Class 2 medical device. And we actually pursued and received an NDC code, which allows our digital health product to be reimbursed under the pharmacy benefit. So for me, it's been really interesting now, having been in digital health for 2 years, just to see how much has changed in 2 years. And with all the noise, as Yarmela said, the activity, the investment, ultimately, I think what we're going to discuss today are really the key questions, which is, what's the business model? Can your product demonstrate outcomes? And can your product actually get reimbursed? And what's the revenue model? So I just think it's a really exciting time to be in digital health, and look forward to the discussion today.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for those introductions. So I mentioned during my introductory comments that investment, and Kevin mentioned this as well, investment's been at record levels for the past 2 years in digital health. With that, we've also seen the development of some really innovative technologies that have started to come to market. And I'm wondering, that's looking back on 2014 and 2015, what do you all see for 2016? What do you think will be the trends in digital health, and where are we going in the next year? And I'll let you speak in whatever order you.
Yeah, I just think the trends are going to be, and we're seeing this if you look at the amount of clinical trials that are now being conducted in digital health. But I think what's going to happen, and what we'll see in 16 and beyond, is an increased focus on clinical trials demonstrating outcomes and providing the evidence to payers and overall to the healthcare system. I think as far as big data, the question is going to be more, how do we integrate the data? And how do we appropriately use that from a population health approach? But those are the three key things I just think will be the focus in 2016.
As I was thinking about this, and I was listening to the State of the Union yesterday, and right at the very beginning, what the president said was we need to invest all the way from teaching our kids how to code all the way to personalizing medicine. And he said that in one sentence. And to me, that really summed up what digital health is all about, right? I mean, how do you take this and then make it really into the personalized medicine? So I think the biggest piece, again, I think you mentioned reimbursement. Where do you make money? That's a key part. And that's the one thing, whether I see it or I hope, maybe it's a mix of those two, is for the public policy folks to start to understand the value what this brings and to drive some action along those lines. And recently we've had Medicare start to talk about figuring out what it means for telemedicine, giving some incentives for patients to adhere to their treatment regime. And as you think about where the money is coming in, I think some of the areas around analytics or sensors or technologies that link up with the moves on the public policy space, I think that's where the action's going to be.
I'm going to be a little bit provocative because it's 8 a.m. and I just want to shake things up. I actually see a lot of turbulence this year. So we've all seen a lot of garbage on the market for the past couple years. I think there's a lot of new investors coming into the sector that will continue to fund things that don't hold up to the clinical and economic utility standards that we're all used to seeing. And in fact, some of these things are often started by people who or by founders who come from a lot of different industries where the standards just aren't the same. So I think this year there's going to be both a shakeout of things that just haven't met the standards, and an increase in investment in generating evidence for things. And then hopefully next year, I don't think this year, but next year, a more broad scaling of the things that actually work. But I just think there's going to be a continued year, just like the past couple years, of experimentation, turbulence, people trying to figure out what the hell is going on, and nobody really understanding how to use these things and how to reimburse for them and fold them into the course of care.
So I'll try to reconcile all of this because I think everything that was said is correct. And I think what this, one of the trends we're going to see and what this really reflects is maturation of the industry, right? And when you have a new industry, this is something that it's part tech, it's part medicine, but really when you think about it, this is an entirely new industry, and that's why it's so exciting. And like any new industry, it has to mature. And that's why we will see more clinical evidence. We will see things that shake out, and players perhaps who shouldn't be in the industry might fall away. But that's not a bad thing, that's actually a good thing, because over time, that'll actually make the industry stronger as it matures. Maybe two other quick trends to put out there. One is this convergence trend. One thing that's extremely exciting is a number of non-traditional players are now entering healthcare. The announcement of Verily, Apple getting involved, all these large players who are very serious players investing a lot of money with very sophisticated people are entering the space. And that opens up a number of possibilities for smaller companies, which is very exciting. And on the other hand, you have a lot of pharmaceutical companies. There's going to be a panel later today talking about this, saying, what's our digital strategy? And the fact that pharmaceutical companies now say, well, we actually have to have a digital strategy, and figuring out what that should be means they're actually moving towards digital. And so you have this whole new industry where both sides are coming together. And the last trend to just put out there is what really enables all of this is the fundamental technology, the platforms, smartphones, tablets, wearables. You're going to see more and more adoption of those. That's a trend that started that's just going to continue. And I think that's good because not only does that make for more platforms, but also as people get more comfortable with the underlying technology, they're also going to be more willing to use them in the context of their own health.
I think those are all really good points. I mean, it's absolutely true that there has been a lot of noise in this industry as it's, rapidly developed over the last couple of years. We've seen, lots of technologies that really just haven't proved their worth and have fallen away. And I think that will continue to happen. But I think that raises an interesting question, which is, and Eric, you started to touch on this, but where are the areas in healthcare where there's really the most opportunity to make a difference? I mean, Vivek, your point about personalized medicine is a really good one. And I think we all, in healthcare, we have this new commitment to personalized medicine, and digital health carries a lot of promise to really, bring that forward. But where are the areas of medicine where there is the most opportunity to make a difference based on what you know today about the industry?
As you think about, so there is the sickness piece of health, which is, here's a patient, I know that they are sick, and how do we get them healthy? And then not only healthy, but on a chronic basis, how do we keep them from getting back into the system? So that's that area. And then there is the whole area about, I'm healthy and I'm going to be, I just want to make sure that I stay healthy, right? So when you look at the cost of healthcare, a lot of that cost is in managing your sicker parts of the population. And as I've seen, again, I'll go back to the public policy, because ultimately what every government wants to do is, in a sense, to maintain peace. And there are a couple of things, right? Prices that people pay every day and whether they're healthy or not. And healthcare tends to be a big area of concern, not only in the US, but around the globe. Because, if you really want to keep people excited or engaged and supporting you, that's an area that every government wants to go invest in. And that's an area that every government actually sees their healthcare budgets just going through the roof. I was talking to to a group from Singapore, advisors to the government there, and they are looking at their healthcare budget doubling in the next 15 years. And a lot of that has to do with, number one, are we identifying people early enough, right? So are we identifying people early enough? And on the far end, once a person goes through the healthcare system, how do we keep them from coming back? So those are the two areas that I'm seeing a lot of focus come in. So early detection, where the signals are relatively weak, but we can predict what's going to happen. And are people adhering to the treatment regime? That's chronic disease management. So those are the two key areas where the cost is, and I think that's where a lot of the benefits or the productivity is going to be.
Absolutely, completely agree. The only other thing I would add to that is, in thinking about monitoring, one of the things we think is key is you have to make it low burden or no burden. One of the real challenges is when someone actually has to actively be involved in the monitoring process, putting on a wearable every day, doing something, opening an app, pressing a ton of buttons, recording a lot of data, that actually is much tougher than if it's something that is completely passive monitoring, and that's where we actually think a lot of the future will be is continuous passive monitoring, particularly, exactly as Vivek said, chronic conditions that are high healthcare burden for the system, particularly ones where, based on healthcare reform and AHA, there's an incentive to keep people out of the hospital, right? Those are kind of almost the low-hanging fruit from a payer perspective. In addition to that, areas we think that are exciting are going to be using some of these monitoring tools in clinical trials. It really opens up a whole realm of possibilities in terms of getting continuous feedback and the type of data that perhaps was never possible to get before in terms of continuous monitoring at home. And then finally, we do think there's this whole realm of interventions that are possible that are essentially drug-like interventions, but delivered in the form of a digital intervention. So Achille Interactive Labs, and the CEO of Achille is going to be speaking later this morning if anyone wants to hear more details on it. It's based on real science coming from UCSF, was published on the cover of the journal Nature. There are a number of clinical studies going on right now, ADHD, autism, there's a partnership with Autism Speaks. Alzheimer's disease, there's a partnership with Pfizer. And the company released some preliminary data in ADHD indicating that use of this product actually has, and this is pilot data, the ability to improve attentional symptoms in ADHD. So we think of this idea of something that is like a therapeutic, but actually is digital, is very intriguing. But it has to be based on real science and have real clinical evidence.
I don't really have anything to add on the categories, the broad categories of opportunity that we see. Early disease detection, digital therapies that are moving the clinical needle, basically. And then medication adherence is the big one. So whenever people talk about digital, oftentimes they equate it or couple it with behavior change. And usually, especially when we're talking to biopharma companies, it's all about adherence and understanding risk in a population to be able to do new pricing strategies, to be able to drive new types of business, to be able to target different populations, et cetera. But the one nuance, or the one sort of nuanced concept I'll introduce to this entire conversation, and it's so great that Kevin's here actually, because I've followed WellDoc for so long now. So WellDoc has FDA approval for their both device, but actually not their device anymore, actually, right? It's software, right? The actual software. And the challenging thing, the great thing about that is they've got an NDC code, they can be reimbursed, et cetera. The challenging thing from a regulatory perspective is every time you want to update that software, what happens? You go through like the entire thing again, right?
No, it can just be a note to file.
It can be a note to file, but it depends on the exact precise change and what they're updating. Yeah. And that's great for a drug that's actually really difficult for software. And so I think one area that needs to change before these things can gain broad adoption is actually some of those regulations actually need to be a little bit more nuanced in allowing these companies to iterate on their product in order to drive both consumer engagement or patient engagement through the process and also understand at a deeper level what's actually moving the needle on behavior.
I think I have to speak first next time. There's not a lot to add. Yeah, I would just bucket, if I was to think of the three areas, with the most promise, it's obviously a focus on chronic disease management, med adherence, and then the use of diagnostics with attachments to smartphones. That would just be my summary.
That's great. That's great. So I think Christine's comments started to get at what my next question was going to be, which is, what are the challenges for the digital health industry in 2016? And I think, Christine, you raise a good point. FDA has gotten a lot of criticism for whether their current system for medical devices is workable for software, especially standalone software, but also devices that include heavy amounts of software. And Kevin's right that it doesn't always necessarily require a new submission to the agency, but nonetheless, the point's a good one, that there is some regulatory burden associated with these technologies. And so, and at the beginning of my comments, I mentioned reimbursement. I mentioned some of the cybersecurity reports we've heard in recent days and over the past year. But I'm going to start with Kevin because he's had to go last a bunch of times. But what other challenges, or of those challenges, which do you think are really the most critical for the digital health industry to get right in the coming year?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what's already been said. I do think the focus is going to shift pretty quickly. And I think there's a lot of noise right now. There's, as Christine said, a lot of us in digital health, some from non-healthcare related environments. But where the discussion is going to transition, I think, pretty quickly with investors and others is going to be really a focus on the business model and the reimbursement, and how is your company going to make money over time. And what I think one of the challenges is really going to be, how do you fit into the workflow, and how do you fit into the appropriate payer environment? And by workflow, I mean, a health system, a health plan, a physician, and then also a patient's life. We can all create the best technology in the world, but if a patient isn't going to find it engaging, if it doesn't have the right UI, UX, we're going to have challenges. But I think the initial challenge is going to be, when you cut through the noise, does your product show outcomes? Can you fit into the healthcare system to show that you decrease costs? And are you able to fit into what is an ever-changing, very complex regulatory and reimbursement environment of healthcare, not just in the US, but globally?
Yeah, so I guess the typical things that you hear, and I'm glad you didn't say one of the typical things actually, but the typical things that you hear about challenges with digital health is actually around data security, data governance, things like this. And of course, that's a challenge, but that's a challenge that is sort of I think every industry should be a lot better about data security. I'm pretty sure my social security number, my email address, all of my preferences are out there for everybody to see if you Google hard enough. And so when it comes to healthcare, obviously that sensitive data is just as sensitive as my financial data, which I'm pretty sure Target leaked all over too. So of course that's one challenge. Of course the FDA and the regulatory environment is different than lots of other industries. But one challenge that I don't often hear, but I see all the time, is a talent challenge. So Vivek brought up, attaching, coding to precision medicine. If you think about digital medicine, if you think about the sort of companion therapies that everyone's trying to make, it requires really specialized talent. And it requires digital teams to couple or partner very closely with people who really understand healthcare at a very deep level. And that's really challenging, to put those people in a room, for those people to ever find each other, and then to put those people in a room and speak a language that everybody can understand without, sort of fighting a lot. And so I see that as one major challenge, is combining true software and also consumer expertise, especially when it comes to digital products, with people with really deep healthcare expertise.
So these were all great points. Maybe just stepping back, maybe a way to summarize it as, because this is a new industry and a new way of doing things, it still has to fit into an existing system. Now, if you look at tech, what's really fascinating is some of the biggest successes that are out there in terms of tech. You think about Uber, Airbnb, the system bent to those companies, right? They went and said, there are a set of rules out there, but we're going to do things differently. We're going to create a great product, and when enough people use it, the system will bend to us. But it doesn't matter how good your product is in healthcare, the system isn't going to bend to you. You have to bend to the system. And I think the challenges that were just articulated, which were great ones, and really I summarized that, really reflects that as the industry matures, and now needs, which is an entirely new industry, and now needs to integrate into an existing framework.
And I think that's a great point. When you think about things like whether it's Uber or whether I want to go on cable or choose Netflix or whatever, right? these are individual choices. In the case of healthcare, individual choice is really not there. You're part of a much bigger system. And in this system are people with very entrenched, they are very entrenched, and it impacts people's jobs, the way they have been doing things all along. And this is not a small industry. Globally, it's a $9.5 trillion industry. So when you think about the scope, the size, all the, all the folks that really have their own personal things that they want to protect, changing it is not just a matter of a few people getting convinced. You really have to bend to the system, figure out how to work with the system, and slowly change it. This is not a small little thing. This is a big, big, big tanker, and you have to slowly change it. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think the smart area is going to be, how do I understand the problems in the system, identify the people who really care about it, and then work the system to get digital in there.
I think those are all really good points. I want to, we've been having a great conversation up here, but I want to make sure that we're also getting at issues that you all care about. And so I want to just take this opportunity. We can go back to having our conversation, but are there questions in the audience, things that you all would like the panelists to address? Anyone, any questions? All right. Oh, yep, there's one over there. And I think he's going to bring you a microphone so that it picks up, they're videotaping, so it'll pick it up.
Hi, it's Erwin Spangday from Click Health. Curious about your thoughts on just content and how content can sort of exist within a multi-channel environment, within the regulatory environment and systems that you guys are building technologies for. Just some comments from that. Thanks.
I think you're actually one of the best to talk about it.
I actually, now my mic's not on, but I think everyone can hear me. For me, the content, from a content perspective, and how it fits into the algorithms that we've built on our platforms, people may disagree, but I actually think that's probably been the easiest, or one of the easier challenges that we face. And by that I mean, if you look at content out there overall right now for most of the, in the chronic disease domain, there's a significant amount of content. I could list the top 5 companies. The question really is more, how do you utilize that content in an appropriate way on your, via your platform and your algorithms to drive the outcomes that you want? And that's, I think, more the trick, which is where I thought Christine's point was really a good one of, just having come from a different environment and then having to learn a whole new set of terminology in digital health, and then to combine programmers and, graphic designers and instructional designers and, with people that are doing reimbursement and marketing, is going to be, I think, one of the opportunities for us moving forward is how do you combine all those different, almost personality types moving forward to create a successful company. But the content I actually think is one of the least of our challenges, and I think there's a lot of content out there.
And the other way I actually think about it is in GE. At GE, we have this thing called health imagination, and what it does is going back to the point of what is the problem you're trying to solve, right? So when you think about within health imagination, we said it's either cost of healthcare, quality that the patient receives, or the access. How many people can actually access that particular area. So when you look at those 3 as the key areas where value needs to be added, you then look at content as a way to get to one of those things, right? Now, whether the content exists today, you say, look, here's a problem I'm going to solve in cost, and I have the content that's needed, or I need to create the content to be able to actually move the needle. I think you got to just put it in that framework and then figure out what is it that exists, what needs to be created, and based on that, then you say, now what kind of analytics and what kind of proof points do I need to generate, coming out of that.
One of the aspects of the intersection of technology and medicine for digital is empowering the patients And especially when you talk about chronic disease management and trying to influence the system and reimbursement, maybe the panel could talk a little bit about how some of the more active, more developed chronic disease patient groups can be part of that process.
It's a great point, and I think one of the real potentials of digital health is empowering patients, right, and giving patients the tools to really take charge of their own health. And from a company perspective, working with groups that are very active in the patient communities can be incredibly powerful and really represents a nice opportunity. So in the case of Achille, there's a partnership with Autism Speaks, because that's going to be one of the areas where Achille is running trials, and that's a fantastic group that's not only understands the space well and can give real insight, but also then can give access in terms of the key opinion leaders, the patients, and really bringing that patient perspective. And to this comment, the comments earlier of how you have to blend technology and medicine, no matter how good your science is, if your user interface is bad and people don't want to pick up the product, it's not going to matter, right? And that's where having the patient perspective is critical, and that's something we found for our digital products, is that iterative cycle of you try it, you see if people will use it, what do they like, what do they not like, and it's that part of it is actually much more of a software approach in terms of making sure that someone will and want to use your product. And it's critical to have the patient perspective and also the caregiver perspective if it's a community of patients where there's an active caregiver component.
I have to admit I haven't really thought about it that much beyond the experience portion of it. But one thing I might throw out, and I'd wonder, is what about the endpoints for these things? What are we trying to optimize with WellDoc? What are we trying to optimize with the video game? What are we trying to optimize with some of these things? I know what a payer and an employer are trying to optimize. They're trying to optimize around a 12-month ROI. They're trying to optimize around some endpoint like BMI reduction that translates into some sort of 12-month ROI. But is that really the best thing for the patient, right? Probably not. And so I think patient advocacy groups could be involved in a way that patient advocacy groups are often involved in trying to do what's best for the patient outside of the system.
Yes, I was just going to give a quick comment. I mean, it all evolves around the patient. If the patients don't use our product, you have no outcomes. And so for us, our whole premise of the company is how do you increase patient engagement to enhance outcomes? And we do that through, in real-time personalized feedback based upon what's going on in a patient's with diabetes life, whether it's their blood glucose reading, whether it's the medication regimen they are on, whether it's some of their medical history or labs that are inputted into the algorithms, is they get a very customized feedback based on what's going on in their life. But what's been really interesting, actually, is now that we've commercialized over the past 2 years, is to actually see, rather than just me sitting up here talking, to actually see what patient engagement looks like. How does it compare to a lot of different commonly prescribed meds that are used in diabetes? What does persistency and attrition look like? What kind of features are patients actually engaging with? What kind of features and content do we need to add based upon the feedback that we've seen? And that's kind of where the reality. I can just tell you, having sat with a lot of potential investors as we just complete our fundraising, one of the first things they want to see is your engagement data. And I think there's a lot of noise, and I think if we've all seen the data on app use in M Health, it's not the most impressive currently. And so I think when you can just say, here's the results, here's patients are how they're engaging, here's the persistency, here's the features that they like, and here's the changes that we have to make on our products so that they're going to engage more. I mean, you look around the room right now, how many people are looking at their phones or checking different apps? I mean, the average person looks at their phone 150 times a day. I think at JP Morgan it's probably more. But, so just think about it. If you don't have an engaging product loaded on someone's phone, they're not going to keep going back and engaging, and you're not going to see results. And the rest of this is really just noise.
I've got it. One way that you can make a big impact and help a lot is being a trusted party for people to be able to give their data over in a safe way so that we can make these products and services more engaging and much better. Like that's actually a key role where someone who's really squarely on the patient side can actually make a big difference. Sorry.
I think those are good points.
Thank you. How about charging the consumer? If it's good enough, has value, why not make them pay?
So, does that mean? I think, as far as charging the consumer, I think everyone knows there's a lot of free apps out there in healthcare. So, for example, right now in diabetes, there's over 1,000 apps just for, that are available for diabetes. I mean, we can all look at the data and the downloads and see how impressive in the persistence and attrition is. I know I've seen research about what will a consumer be willing to pay for an mHealth product, and I think it varies. I think when you strip out, and I'll answer your question, but actually when you think of in a true healthcare environment, for a product to reimburse, there typically tends to be a copay. And I think, to twist that question around is more, what is the product? Is it purely a consumer-based product or is it a prescription product? And if it's a consumer-based product, I think what you're seeing is free apps all the way up to $4.99 for a premium. I think the question, that we've kind of worked through over the past couple of years is, what is a patient willing to pay out of pocket in a copay environment for a reimbursed digital health product? So sorry, did I answer your question?
No.
Okay.
Have you tried to charge consumers?
Our product is prescription based. So ours is reimbursed, and then there is a copay. We have a copay program similar to every other pharmaceutical product on the market. It depends on the individual's health plan and reinsurance or insurance and coverage, whether there is actually going to be any out of pocket. So to answer your question, yes, some patients do get charged, just like all of us in the room might get charged for various medications.
I mean, people bought a lot of Fitbits, right? I'm sort of being flippant, but I'd love to see Omada's data on, they have an independent consumer direct program. I've heard anecdotally several people who've enrolled in this program paid out of their own pocket for it, even though if they were part of certain payer members groups like Humana's, they would get partially reimbursed. People pay for gyms, people pay, one thing I like to say is the rent is getting too damn high, right? It's just so expensive, high deductible plans, things like this. People are gonna start hacking their way to better health because they just can't afford to be sick anymore. And so maybe there's something clever to do where paying for things is part of their deductible, right? Works towards their deductible, but they're still paying for the whole thing. I think creative things like that are gonna start to come up, maybe not this year, but maybe next year or the year after. Right, and I think what we saw in the past couple years, though, is a lot of those companies didn't work, right? A lot of companies went straight to the consumer, tried to charge them some subscription fee per month, and it actually didn't work. And so you saw a lot of them go to employers and payers and do this kind of mucked up thing called B2B2C, right, model, which is actually kind of mucked up to me, but that's kind of what had to happen for these companies to continue offering their products and services.
I think.
It's healthcare screening. I learned about them recently. I have no connection to them whatsoever. But they screen about 1 million patients a year. It's about $185 for the patient to get screened. And it's completely non-reimbursed. And they're a little over $100 million in revenue.
Yeah, good for them.
Yeah,
I hope they're going to be more like them. That's awesome. That's great.
I'm curious about your perspectives as to the possibility of digital health companies going the same way and providing value enough to charge consumers directly.
Yeah, segment your market really well. Craig Ventnor's group, I think, charges, $25K for their entire genome, exome screening, right? So just segment your market properly, and I'm sure, there are definitely models for that. Absolutely. We're not refuting that at all.
Yeah, I think in some ways this may get a little bit at the issue that they were talking about earlier, which is, do you bend the system to you or does the system bend to you? And I think to a certain extent, consumers are not are not. There are certainly people who pay out of pocket for healthcare, whether that's where they paid their physicians directly instead of participating in health insurance or other models. But I think in general, consumers are not used to paying directly for healthcare, and so I wonder if maybe that's one of the challenges that the industry faces in figuring out whether to go directly to the consumer, especially when you're talking about things like Kevin was raising, where it's a prescription product, right, which is sort of controlled by the regulatory scheme, and so if it's something that they have to have a prescription for from their doctor, they may not be used to paying for that out of pocket, and that may be a conceptual challenge as well.
And from a healthcare system viewpoint, not from a company viewpoint, there definitely is a market for the worried well, the very well-to-do worried well self-quantifier, and that's a great, could be a very nice market, and it's providing a real service for people who want it. But going back to Vivek was mentioning in the beginning, what he sees as the opportunity is chronic disease, right? And if you think about ultimately, what will save the system money, it's going to be having wider access to technologies that can really make an impact on some of these high-cost conditions. And one of the nice things about digital is that can scale at a very large level, but that is a little bit different than a consumer product aimed at a particular segment of the population.
Are there other questions from the audience? So I have one more question for our panel. We've talked a lot about 2016 and the future, but digital health is something that's been talked about, and products have been in development for years now. Where are the areas where you think there have already been, whether it's a single solution that you've seen or areas of medicine, where you think that digital health has already played a big role and has made a transformation or really changed the way we think about something in healthcare or medicine? And maybe I'll start in the middle, if Eric or Christine have any thoughts on that, since we've been starting on one end or the other.
Well, quite frankly, I think the biggest impact is yet to come. So I think it's really over the course of the next 2 years, 3 years, we're going to see more and more of an impact. I think, if you had to say practically what's really changed in terms of digital, it's really been access to information, right? You think about now people are carrying a compendium of information on their phone, and they have the ability to access that information. And sometimes you'll hear some doctors like this, some doctors don't like this, but someone goes and says, "Oh, doctor, you're telling me this, but wait, I'm looking at this thing right here," or "I was on this social network and I was talking to these other patients, and this is what they told me." And so it's many of the same types of thing that a patient would want in any context, where they might go and try to read a book, or they might try to ask someone. But now, instead of doing that, they have access to a tremendous amount of information through digital means, or the ability to communicate through social networks. And I think that's really actually made a big impact, both in terms of how patients think about healthcare, but then in terms of day-to-day interactions in terms of medicine. And it's also positive because, of course, physicians and providers have that type of information at their fingertips also.
I'm going to go way back, right? Back in the 60s and 70s. And you never think of 60s and 70s as something that's digital, right? But imagine if you had something that was wrong with you. There's something called exploratory surgery, right? The doctor would open you up because they didn't know what the heck was wrong, right? So let me open you up, let me see what's going on, right? So in my mind, the first application of digital health was once we were able to digitize what's happening with X-rays, and you were able to translate that into a CT image, it completely changed the world. Nobody does exploratory surgery now because you can see what's inside. And that power came from being able to digitize the information. When you think about the biologics, when you think about stem cell therapy, being able to digitize your genome, understand what's going on, and then translating that into taking care, into providing specific therapies that are targeted to you, that's happening today. So those are some of the key areas where I think digitization, getting information, being able to combine it into something that's useful for the patient has already made a huge difference. Now, as you were saying, there's a ton of other things that we think about digital today. And it takes a little bit of time, but we're going to see the same kind of value emerge from digitizing the information, from making this information mobile, where it's available to anybody, and being able to apply the digital tools or analytics or a much broader population-based analytics that's going to create the values that we can only dream of today.
I have two impacts. One is Dr. Google, like the ability for someone to just enter, a bunch of symptoms into Dr. Google, especially this like a favorite pastime of hypochondriacs like me, and then go to their doctor and go, I'm convinced I have X, and I Googled this medication is really bad for me, or it's really good for me, or can I try? So Dr. Google has made a huge impact, I think, on the system overall that we don't actually quite fathom quite yet. I think the second thing is the original quantified selfers are people with diabetes, right? Patients with diabetes. So this notion that you could correlate blood glucose level with something called an A1C in order to measure the progression of the disease, and then use those quantities or use those numbers or those metrics in order to modulate the amount of insulin that you take, in order to encourage people to behave a little bit differently or eat different foods or get rest when they're supposed to or go exercise. Now imagine a world where for almost every chronic illness, we have those metrics to modulate the way that the drug gets delivered, especially with the new types of drugs that are coming on market, the new types of specialty drugs that are coming on market. Imagine a world where we could give people those metrics to manage their disease, where all of a sudden it makes sense, yes, I should go to bed now because my rheumatoid arthritis number is X, or maybe I shouldn't have that glass of wine, or maybe I should go for a brisk walk. So I think we're still early in the game. It's still very early in the game, but that's sort of the promise and sort of the vision, I think, for lots of digital therapies and digital medicines and digital tools that I see, 5-10 years out.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the question now. I think it was, how has digital health made the biggest difference? And to me, it's more, we're having a different discussion in healthcare now than we used to. So if you think of the convergence of technology in healthcare, where now there's an increased focus on the consumer that I think wasn't there before. When you look at what's going on now with Google, with Apple, with Samsung, with IBM, imagine what we're going to be talking about a year or two from now about where digital health is. But to me, I think the biggest difference that digital health has made to date is that we've changed the discussion, and it's a focus on value and prevention versus just the treatment, and it's a focus on the consumer.
So I'm going to turn one last chance for questions, and if not, I have one last question for our panel. Okay. Oh, there's one in the back.
Can I just shout it out?
Where? Oh, Suzanna's coming with the microphone.
So let's say you guys each got $1 billion to spend on digital health. You can't spend it on your own thing. How would you invest it to totally change the game? What would make a huge difference?
That's an excellent question.
I would invest in, when you look at a couple of areas that are big, chronic management for cardiac diseases, that's a huge area. I would figure out an end-to-end solution that identifies people early on who have a risk of that you can monitor, that you can track whether they are going bad, and for managing people, but do it in a complete end-to-end health system area to really make a huge difference.
So do you want a return on that $1 billion? Because that's a different question. But if you don't want an IRR, I would sequence everybody, and I would do, Theranos is a loaded word right now, or a loaded company, but I would probably try to do that correctly so that people can have better measures of both their propensities for certain things and better measures of their progression along certain outcomes.
Yeah, I love that question. First thing I do is raise my salary. Just kidding. If I had $1 billion, I just think, again, what we haven't talked today about on the panel at all is what's going on with partnerships and collaboration. And I think one of the things that I would do and what's going to happen in this industry is you're going to see an increased amount of consolidation of players in digital health and adjacent places. So first thing I do is do some acquisitions. Secondly, I think that the partnership aspect, I think, we talked about this before, but I think that, the first thing I do is expand our portfolio, via acquisition so we have a full solution. But secondly, I would fund a significant amount of clinical trials in conjunction with payers across the chronic disease domain that have that outcomes that I think will generate the reimbursement.
So, and by the way, if this isn't a theoretical question, I'd like to talk to you afterwards. This is like... I think with that type of money, what could really be achieved is very large-scale population health studies looking at digital analytics for continuous monitoring, which are based on machine learning, where the more data you have, the better the algorithms get. And that can take a number of different forms. But once you get into that type of scale, having more data is better and better. Now, I actually think those types of studies can be done relatively low cost with volunteers, and that's with the emergence of things like ResearchKit. That was the whole idea. But of course, if you had the resources to actually pay people, that would be fantastic. And then I think the other thing is, it goes to the earlier question: what are we excited about? And digital therapeutics. The idea of actually having digital interventions that have drug-like effects, those trials can, they can add up. And so being able to take a digital therapeutic and run it across many, many different populations at a large scale with that type of capital resource would be fantastic.
All right. I want to ask one last thing, which is here we are in the same building as the as the biotech showcase. There's a panel this afternoon about how the pharmaceutical industry is thinking about digital health. But I want to just ask, Kevin started on this, but I want to just ask the rest of you, where do you see the synergies between digital health, pharma, biopharma, biotech, medtech? Where do you think are the synergies in how we move forward with all of this?
I think the synergies, the thing that ties the two together is the patient, right? And the way I think about the synergies is think of the patient and think about creating a digital twin of the patient, which is how do I take what's happening to the patient, whether it's anatomy, whether it's biochemical processes, whether it's the genome, whether it's the vital signs. How do you create the digital twin and characterize the patient, and then use that information along with the pharmaceuticals to figure out how do those pharmaceuticals interact with my digital twin to target the therapies that personalized medicine for that particular patient. That's how I see the synergies between the two.
Yeah, I think there are definitely synergies, and then a lot of pharma companies right now are trying to figure out their digital health strategy, and I'd really put it into two buckets. One is monitoring a patient and characterizing the phenotype of a patient, either to determine things like, is the patient taking their medicine? Is there an opportunity for compliance? Is our drug working? That can be in the context of clinical trials or post-market. So I think a lot of the pharma uptake early on will be more on using digital health as tools to advance their existing pipeline and products, so more traditional pharmaceuticals, or as co-branding opportunities as they do detailing. But I think moving beyond that, what I'll be a little bit bold here and say maybe in 10 years we'll see pharmaceutical companies that will have a digital health division, right? That will actually have digital therapeutics. Because if you can actually have digital interventions that are very safe but could have drug-like effects, that actually is a big market, and it's really a new type of therapeutic. And so, not tomorrow, but I could see eventually the industry evolving to the point where you do see thinking evolve from, okay, let's use this as a monitoring tool, to let's actually start to think about digital in the context of therapeutics.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Digital therapeutics sound awesome. I think they're long term. I think they just sound awesome, right? I'll tell you what I'm hearing from the market today. The people we work with lots of biopharma companies. Here's how they're using it. They're using it to quantify risk. They're using it to reduce churn, digital products and services alongside the pill to reduce churn. They're using it to, understand what's going on in their patient populations and improve medication adherence. Those are the 4 big themes today that are happening in biopharma. And sorry, I'll do one other, is to accurately measure disease progression to the end of those other 3 things, basically. That's how people are using it. That's why they're approaching us today. Those are the use cases we often hear. The really tangible ones. So I think there's lots of other opportunities in the future for these things, but those are the 4 today.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add from what I previously said, but when I think of digital health, we have Samsung as a partner, we have Merck as an investor, and we're having significant other discussions with people in the med device and pharma space. And I think why it's going to be so important and why you're going to see it evolve pretty quickly is having lived in big pharma for years, it's not known for innovation. And I wouldn't bet on them to figure out digital health. And so what you're going to see is an increased amount of partnerships and collaborations. And why that's going to be important for digital health companies is I think in order to scale effectively, we're going to have to have collaborations and partnerships.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you to our panel for their comments today, and thank you to all of you for being here.